This has a long history, but we don't want to be here forever. So we're going to start in the 1980s. In 1989, President George Bush, the senior, held an education summit with the National Governors Association, and the head of the Governors Association at that time was a man named William Clinton. At that summit, they came up with an education plan, and that's when they decided to break local control and set national education goals. That summit eventually led to federal legislation called Goals 2000. It was passed when President Clinton was in office, but that demanded that the states write all of the hundreds of standards that we're seeing. So when people talk about the states having standards, that's because the federal government required them to do that. This has been a federal mandate from the beginning. The feds forced the states into writing the hundreds and hundreds of standards that then later they complained about. Goals 2000 was vigorously opposed all across the country, and so it had no teeth. If states didn't comply, if school districts didn't meet the goals, there were no penalties. That changed with the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2001. Now, there is no role for the federal government in education, according to our Constitution. If you read the Constitution, you won't see the word education. So the way the federal government gets around that is they make money available to the states. And it's, here's the money, and the state can volunteer to take the money. If they volunteer to take the money, then they're volunteering to live by all of the requirements of the money. But since the state is volunteering, that's how they get around the constitutional proscription. The first time that the federal government offered lots and lots of money to the states in education was in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson was president. The legislation was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was 32 pages long. That made money available as part of the war on poverty. So the states turned in their poverty figures, and then they got money based on those figures. When the federal government makes money available to the states, you get this much money for this many years. When that many years is over, the money runs out. So the federal government either has to reauthorize the program and make more money available, or the program dies. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been reauthorized multiple times since 1965. The 2001 reauthorization was called No Child Left Behind. This year it was reauthorized again, and it was called the Every Student Succeeds Act. No Child Left Behind said that the states had to create plans that included content standards and achievement standards. What's the difference? A content standard says this is what the school must teach. An achievement standard says this is what a child must learn. It was a mandate from the federal government to the individual child. To put that in perspective, let's move it to healthcare. A content standard. Every doctor must give all of their diabetic patients this much insulin. An achievement standard. Everybody in this room has to have the same blood pressure. Can I mandate that you all have the same blood pressure? Of course, well, I can, but that's not going to make it happen. Your ability to learn is as unique as your blood pressure. Yet the federal government attempted, through this legislation, to mandate achievement. The states were told that they had to have these standards. They had to apply to every public school child in the state in math and reading and eventually science. The states had to set up levels of achievement. The highest level was called advanced. Proficient, which would be passing. Basic was like a C- or a D. You knew something, you weren't actually failing, but you really didn't know what it was. The states then were required every year to show that the kids were making progress based on state assessment tests, and the legislation mandated that by the close of the 2013-2014 school year, every state demonstrate that 100% of the students in that state were proficient in math and in English language arts by a state assessment. So the states had to create these state assessments, and they gave them, No Child Left Behind mandated how often they had to be given, and then there was a timeline, and every year the state had to get closer to that 100% standard. But the states could define proficient however they wanted. Now, No Child Left Behind has died. This year, or actually last year, the U.S. government reauthorized that original Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. So what are the differences? Because what you are told is it got rid of a lot of federal mandates, it returned control to the states. So let's look at it. The No Child Left Behind said that between grades 3 and 5 there had to be one test. Now many states did annual testing, but in fact No Child Left Behind didn't require that. It only required one test in math and in English. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act requires a test every year, so that's 3 tests instead of 1. No Child Left Behind said between grades 6 and 9, 1 test was required. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act said, no, 3 tests, 1 in grade 6, grade 7, and grade 8. And then No Child Left Behind said 1 in high school, and the Every Student Succeeds said 1 in high school. So the mandated number by the federal government in No Child Left Behind was 3, but Every Student Succeeds mandates 7 tests. So that's an increase in the federally mandated testing requirements. No Child Left Behind said there had to be a 95% participation rate, but the language and the law didn't really talk about parental opt-out. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires now there has to be a state law for parents to opt out or refuse the test. The language actually says there has to be a state law, but it says that districts are penalized if parents have an opt-out rate of more than 5%. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education just put out a letter at the end of December, and I have a copy here if you'd like to see it at the end, where they tell the states all about what they have to do to force the 95% participation and all of the punishments that will happen if they don't comply. So if your state says that you can opt out and a parent exercises their legal right, the U.S. Department of Education is saying we will punish your district if parents exercise their legal right to be parents. That is not less federal control, that is more federal control. The testing time in No Child Left Behind, there were no limits in the legislation. The new legislation says only a limited amount of time is allowed for the tests, but they mandate more tests at the federal level, which means that the federal tests become the only test, as opposed to a district saying, well, we may want to give the Iowa test or a regular achievement test. If we're going to mandate more tests and then limit how much testing you're allowed to take, then my tests become the tests, which means no other measurement option becomes available to parents. The No Child Left Behind mandated 100% proficiency. The new legislation doesn't mandate 100% proficiency, but it does say that every state has to show that the children have improved on the tests every year. So it's mandatory improvement. That's still a federally mandated achievement standard. We're going to mandate learning. So since the tests are so important, why don't we talk about the tests? How do you know how you did on a test? You look at the score. Now, most of us are used to looking at a raw